when I think of responsible use of AI, it's not a binary decision of using new technology or not. It's a first step of thinking like, what are the considerations that are important? And through our research, we hope to add to this conversation an awareness that there could be ethical considerations for some uses. And as society, right now we are grappling with the meaning of what does it mean to use AI responsibly.
Yeah. AI is rolling into the workplace fast, but regulatory frameworks for use are patchy. Some states are trying to pass their own laws, but others aren't. And at the federal level, regulation is still up in the air. That uncertainty leaves a lot of responsibility for individual workers and organizations to decide what is responsible use. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily DeJeu, host of Tepper Perspectives Video and an assistant teaching professor of business communication at the Tepper School of Business. I'm here with Sofía Rodríguez Chaves, a PhD student in organizational behavior and theory at the Tepper School of Business, and Dr. Taya Cohen, professor of organizational behavior and business ethics. They study this kind of problem. Their most recent work as Gen AI fellows at the Tepper School Center for Intelligent Business explores how people's moral character shapes their choices about using AI at work when formal rules don't exist. Welcome.
Hi, happy to be here.
Glad you're here. So let's start. Let's kind of get a broad context, and then that'll help us, I think, situate your work. AI regulation in the US is, as I said, pretty spotty. For example, recently we've seen headlines about Congress debating maybe a 10-year moratorium. And we can think about California, for instance, passing and then vetoing major AI safety bills. Your research kind of addresses this. It suggests that without clear policies in place, individual employees' moral awareness is what really matters. Can you talk about what you found and why this gap between policy and practice is so important?
Regulation is often going to be slower than the pace of innovation, and questions about how to use AI responsibly can't be about the development of the tools. And so this makes the individual decision-making of the employees critical to study and is what motivated the current project, where we're trying to understand the sense-making people have about what is this new technology, what can it do, and how can we use it responsibly? How can we use it to make work better? And what should be automated? What should not be automated? And so with that as background, we started a couple years ago now trying to understand what are the considerations employees have.
Yeah.
With that in mind, we surveyed employees about anything and everything, because at the time we were not entirely sure how people were thinking about these tools. So we started by asking, what do they use it for? How often do they use these tools? Are they using it at all? Because it somehow seemed that it was, and everyone was using it, but that might also just have been within our bubbles. So we wanted to know. So we started by asking these things, also asking them, have you received any guidance from your organization on how to use this or whether to use it at all? And what we found is over 50% of the people reported there's no instruction on whether or how to use these tools. And so we then asked them about what they think about when making that decision. And that is when we started seeing how people with higher moral awareness and moral character actually think about, oh, is this aligned to my values? Is this aligned to what I want to represent myself at work?
So it sounds like in the absence of guidance from an employer, maybe, certainly from the state in which an employee lives or the federal government, in the absence of guidance, it sounds like one of the things that was a good indicator in your study was the employee's own moral awareness, as you called it, right?
Yes.
my own kind of sense of right and wrong. When you dug in, what were some of the moral awareness features, traits maybe, that drove how people thought about using or not using AI?
Yeah, as I maybe briefly mentioned, we had participants. I have about 600 answers stuck in my brain forever. Some of the participants were questioning, does this align to my values? Is this plagiarizing? Am I actually considering any other repercussions within my workplace? We also had people, one person mentioning the environment.
Yeah.
A lot of people questioning reputational costs. If people find out that I'm not doing my job and it's a tool doing it, what is going to happen? Am I going to lose my job? Or what are people going to think about me? We also had people questioning the broader implications of using AI at work.
Yeah.
If AI is doing my job, why am I here then? And those are very interesting thoughts that we were not necessarily expecting, because this is framed within a work context.
Yeah.
So we were expecting a lot of efficiency arguments, quality of the product arguments, but there's still people thinking about more moral and ethical considerations when they're using these tools.
Yeah.
And to situate this within the broader literature and what we know about business ethics and the psychology of ethical decision making, we wanted to first start with awareness, to see what are the considerations. And so when you think of what drives ethical behavior and outcomes, you can kind of work backwards from there to think of what are the judgments of right and wrong. And in this space, it's not clear, precisely what is the best way to use different technologies responsibly, because that's going to look different for different kinds of jobs and in different industries. And as the technology develops, that may change. And so if you go then backwards from moral judgment, the first step there is thinking about, well, what are people thinking about? What are they noticing? And then prior work that I had done in a non-AI context, we had talked about the character lens, meaning that some people who are relatively higher in moral character are thinking about decisions differently than those who are relatively lower in moral character, meaning they are honing in on or aware of considerations about how their actions may affect other people.
Yeah.
And if we think at the core, what is ethics and morality, often we can bring that back to potential harms in some way. And you can think about harms very broadly or very narrowly. And when we think about technology use, some people are not considering the implications of their actions at all. It's really just about the immediate business needs and can this help or not? And then others are thinking much more long-term, much more maybe holistically about how does this choice here about using AI for a report or not, what implications does that have? And that doesn't mean a person should use it or not, because there's ethical implications of not using new technology, right? That could be, in some cases, be more harmful. And so we started there, grounding our work in what we know about moral awareness and how that influences the ethical decision-making process. Yeah. And then, as Sofía was mentioning, through that, we were looking at the particular considerations about AI, this new technology, and how are people making sense of these considerations, and what are they thinking about or not?
Can you talk a little more about how you studied this question through the lens of moral awareness?
Of course. Well, to begin with, how we define moral awareness, because all of the rest of the research depends on that, is just this ability of people to recognize that the decision they're about to make has moral implications and whether they ascribe any importance to that recognition. And so to do this, we started with what at the time maybe seemed simple, but it actually proved to give us a lot of information. And it was just a scenario where we tell people, you are about to make a report for an important client. Your organization yet has no rulings about whether or how to use AI. In the past, you've taken hours to compile the information, analyze the information, and write the report, but you've recently become aware of this new AI tool.
Yeah.
And so when you're making the decision of whether to use it or not, what are your considerations? That is the first question that we ask. We later ask, will you actually use it or not? And other questions. But what we find is there is this separation in how people see this, whether is it a consideration about me? Does this align with me and who I want to present myself as? Or does it affect how others will perceive me. And that is an interesting push and pull of what we find in people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so by asking people to think about this common situation, you have a report to use this new technology really to AI or not, our first step was to map the landscape of considerations. And then after reading about all the various considerations people might have, organizing them in a way to identify what are some of the more ethical issues people are raising, whatever the issues related to people's self and identity, what are the considerations related to their reputation, and of course business related issues, including efficiency, the quality of the work, their productivity. And so there was a subset of respondents who spontaneously mentioned ethical issues, and Sofía spoke a little bit about them. And then there was also respondents who mentioned issues about how others might view them, which sometimes we might think of as related to ethical behavior. You know, there's sometimes when teaching business ethics, people talk about the newspaper test. You know, how would you feel if your behavior ended up on the front page of the newspaper, right? And with the idea that when our actions become publicized, that might trigger some moral emotions that might help regulate our behavior. And so separating these two about the internal considerations about how my decision to use an AI tool or not is related to my own values, my own sense of how to do good work or not, versus how my decision might be viewed by other people. That distinction resonated with me from my prior work where I had distinguished the moral emotions of guilt and shame. And so guilt and shame, briefly, are two emotions that we might experience if we do something wrong. But there's a key distinction between them. Guilt is focused on your behavior. I did a bad thing. And if you do a bad thing, even if no one knows about it, then it is an uncomfortable feeling. But what you can do in the future is do something different, repair for that, apologize. And that tends to lead to moral behavior, ethical behavior. And a lot of my prior work on guilt proneness, people's tendency to anticipate if they did a bad thing, they would feel bad about it. And that drives a lot of moral behavior and is a key element of moral character. What's interesting about guilt, it's closely related to shame, but shame is much more about how I would feel if others saw what I did and my reputational considerations. Right? I'm a bad person. And in the work and the experiment we were doing in AI, we could see that some people were mentioning these reputational considerations. I wouldn't want my coworkers to find out. I would be ashamed if others knew that I was using these AI tools, right? Because the norms are still in flux. And at the times we were collecting data, people weren't sure whether this would be acceptable or not. And those considerations about how others would view the behavior, right, those were not necessarily related to moral awareness. But what were is people's own internal considerations that for me and my values, I think this would be a good use of the tools or not. And that distinction between focusing on one's internal sense of right and wrong versus more reputational considerations proved to be important in differentiating what might be related to moral awareness.
Interesting. So let's build on that. We're really focusing right now on this sort of felt sense of my values and internally and then maybe externally, how will people perceive me? In your work, one striking finding, you could say striking, I think, is that only 12% of participants spontaneously raised ethical issues when they were deciding whether or not to use AI at work in the data you collected, which means that nearly 9 out of 10 people apparently weren't thinking about AI use in moral terms. What does that mean for how most workers are approaching AI right now, would you say? I'm wondering, do you think this is a problem? Could this create problems for companies? Do you see that differently?
When we began this work, we didn't know if any employees would consider ethical issues. So what should the baseline be? Should it be 100%, people mentioning these ethical considerations? Should it be 0? So there's some people who are thinking about these in ethical terms. And certainly in different organizations, in different industries, I imagine we'd see a lot of variability in that. The scenario we presented to participants about writing a report is rather innocuous, right? The harms are not severe in magnitude. So we know that moral intensity, when there's greater harms, is going to trigger more ethical concerns. But we deliberately chose a situation where it was not particularly high in moral intensity.
Yeah.
And so even there, maybe, the fact that some people were mentioning ethical issues, we thought was important. But on the other hand, what seemed to dominate more of the considerations that people had was more business-related concerns, which makes sense because the question we posed was a business-related problem about would you use this tool to complete your work? And what's interesting about AI is that because of the complexity of it, because people don't feel a lot of confidence generally about understanding exactly what's going on in the back end, that may lead people to focus on other considerations maybe that are not necessarily ethical considerations because they're not sure how to think about these new technologies.
Yeah. And also what other researchers have been proposing is that when we are facing new technologies that, as Taya just mentioned, they're so complicated that we might not even understand. What we see them as, and they use these three words, mysterious, complex, and non-human. And so that is how people are approaching these new technologies. And there's this inherent trust that we put in the people who build them, and we assume that the system's going to work perfectly. And so that is just what is working in the background for most people. And that is what we find. People are just thinking, oh, this is a system. Systems are not necessarily or inherently ethical or unethical. So should that even be a consideration when I'm thinking about using it? Someone surely already thought about this. And that is what we see. So even if it's just the 12%, I think we think that was a great finding because at the beginning, as Saya just said, we were not even sure anyone was going to bring it up.
So, you were surprised that maybe anybody had top of mind ethical concerns, which is a great way to frame that what we might consider a low percentage. But let's say the fact that employees would consider this in ethical terms, right, and think about how it aligns or doesn't align with their values, we have that. And then we have companies, and it seems like a lot of companies are eager to dive headfirst into AI adoption for efficiency. And so I wonder if those things could be in tension. We have employees who are uncertain about use, and we have corporate leadership that is saying we must adopt or die. And the whole purpose is to use widely to gain these efficiencies that are promised. Do you see that as a tension? And if so, what do you think we should do about that tension?
Well, organizations, that is just how they're doing it. Full AI first as a mission statement. That is our strategy. But that does not mean humans don't have a role to play. And so these characteristics of being a critical thinker of how are we using these tools becomes maybe even more relevant. And as we maybe say here at our school, it's human-driven AI adoption. That is sort of how we see this. It's not that humans are going to be completely phased out of the workplace. No, humans are actually going to play a role that it's more critical about how these technologies are being used. And that is when that awareness of the responsibility of that use. How am I using this? Am I using this correctly? Is this the use that this specific tool was designed for? What are the implications of just letting the tool do the entirety of the work versus doing a part of it? Those are the things that will become more important, or one could expect to become more important within organizations.
And echoing what Sofía mentioned about the Tepper School, and one of our core values is data-informed, human-driven. One of the goals of our research is to provide some data into what are the considerations that might be possible, what are the business-related considerations, what are the ethical-related considerations, and self and identity-related considerations as well. And what is interesting to me, thinking back to maybe about a year ago when Sofía was first presenting this work internally in some of our seminar series, some questions were like, are there any ethical considerations here? Like, should I be thinking about that? Because there's this new tool, that I have on my computer, and it seems like it can be helpful, and it seems like it's high quality. Like, I didn't even realize I should be thinking about that. And so when I think of responsible use of AI, it's not a binary decision of using new technology or not. It's a first step of thinking like, what are the considerations that are important? And through our research, we hope to add to this conversation an awareness that there could be ethical considerations for some uses. And as society, right now we are grappling with the meaning of what does it mean to use AI responsibly.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, if we pan out, we are at this inflection point when we don't have a lot of clear guidance at the federal level, at state levels, even as you're showing at a corporate level, right? My company isn't even issuing guidance. As we are grappling with, as you say, how do we use this powerful technology? What kinds of conversations do you think we should be having based on your work, maybe relative to the kinds of conversations we actually are having currently?
When I think of the conversations that we are having, it's dominating a lot of the news reporting and a lot of the public conversations. They tend to be at the extremes, right? So we see the optimism about what technology can bring and the great things, how AI is changing the world in very positive ways. And you certainly see some vocal supporters. And that's where we get a lot of the AI first.
Yeah.
Right? And then we see the extremes on the other end, raising concerns and alarms and red flags. And a lot of the conversations, as you highlighted in the beginning of our conversation, is about, well, what can the regulators do? Like, whose responsibility is it? Well, it's the regulators. We have to pass laws. I think those will never keep up with the changes. And then on the developer's end, you can't forecast or predict how people will use all of these tools. So the key insight that I think our work brings is it's not one conversation we need to be having, that all of us need to be part of these conversations, because different employees, different individuals bring different points of view into this conversation, and no one has all of the expertise or ideas to be able to answer this very complex problem. And so rather than having the conversations dominated by any one point of view or any one particular content, it's having more people contribute to the conversation. And I think that's lacking now, especially about how workers in organization, what is their responsibility and what do organizations want the responsibility to be versus management's deciding or there's no guidance at all.
Yeah. So Sofía, as we end, you received the K&L Gates Presidential Fellowship for AI Ethics recently. Congratulations. I'm wondering what's next in that fellowship to build on the research that you and Taya have done together.
Thank you. At the end of this project, because we were seeing all of these people mentioning ethical considerations, having moral awareness. However, that was not driving decision making in terms of people were still using the tool because it is still useful. It is, and that is, we saw as a good thing. But then we were wondering what specifically then is this affecting in terms of behavior? And so we continued the project, and what we find is it's about whether we fully automate or not. And so we have initial preliminary findings of people who have higher moral character, moral awareness, are not automating as much. They're not fully giving their word to the AI tool. They're maybe using it for help as an assistant. And so we want to dig deeper into that. What is it in terms of how people use the tool that is changing when they have this awareness of these ethical issues? And so that is a project that we will continue with this fellowship.
Very exciting. We look forward to it. Taya Cohen, Sofía Rodríguez Chaves, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for watching. Please visit the Center for Intelligent Business at cmu.edu/intelligent business and tepperspectives.cmu.edu for more videos, articles, and the Tepper Perspectives podcast.